From Simply Tax World Headquarters in Chicago, this is Simply Tax with Damien Martin.
Hello and welcome. It's Wednesday, September 15, 2021, and today we have a look at the latest on possible tax changes and what they might mean for you and your wallet. Earlier this summer, in episode 126 of the podcast, guest Travis Lucas predicted a busy fall for Congress on multiple fronts, and it's a prediction that certainly appears to be holding true based on the first few weeks of September. In August, the House and Senate adopted a budget reconciliation resolution, setting up work on the Democrats' $3.5 trillion spending and tax package. The Senate also passed a bipartisan infrastructure bill, and House Democrats agreed to vote on the bill by September 27th, with all of this, of course, coming at the same time as other significant legislative priorities to accomplish, which include government funding and the country's debt limit. Fast forward to this week, and on Monday, September 13, 2021, House Democrats released their highly anticipated 881-page legislative text detailing their proposed tax increases. To help you cut through the headlines that are swirling in the tax world right now, we check back in with Travis Lucas. The conversation you're about to hear was recorded at 2 p.m. Eastern on September 14th. Things may have changed by the time you listen.
You know, when we last visited, which I think was the first part of August, we talked about a lot of things, but we mainly talked about what I called 5 tectonic plates that were shifting around. And those plates are still shifting around. In fact, they're all converging right now, even with a recess. And so there's a lot of information that we could retread, but we won't necessarily do that.
Okay.
But where they are now is the House is going through about 12 committees to put together those 12 authorizing committees, pieces of legislation, if you will, that would ultimately go into this budget reconciliation package. They're supposed to get that. We'll talk about maybe the schedule here in a moment. They're supposed to finish that really tomorrow. So you've got that. You've got issues with this bipartisan infrastructure package that the Senate has already passed, but the House has not taken it up. You also have, as part of one of those tectonic plates that we discussed, the debt ceiling and how complicated that is to resolve it. So we'll talk about that. And then, of course, fiscal year 2022 spending, which that deadline is September the 30th. And so all of these things are having to be addressed really in short order, and votes are elusive, just as what we talked about before.
That counting the votes, I believe you called it, is just so important right now. So
right.
We'll take them in that order. I mean, man, you talk about a lot of things to deal with in a matter of less than a month here, right? I mean, we're down to it. So I guess with the reconciliation and a lot of conversations going on, I have to imagine, and like you said, watching and counting those votes. So how is that process going, and what should we be looking out for specifically there?
Well, maybe let's answer that by way of kind of at least the House schedule, what the House is doing. And we'll use that as maybe the vehicle to talk about this elusive vote getting. And we can expand on that. As I spoke about a moment ago, September the 15th, kind of arbitrary deadline where all 12 House committees, authorizing committees like Ways and Means for Tax, Energy and Commerce Committee, there's all these other ones. They have to come through and pass their pieces of legislation that would ultimately then be considered by the Budget Committee. Okay, so the Budget Committee will take next week all of those 12 things that have passed out of these committees. They'll assemble them. It's actually 13 committees, not 12. It's 12 in the Senate, 13 in the House. And they will assemble that entire package. Incidentally, the Budget Committee can't really modify anything. They can't say, oh, well, you know, the Energy and Commerce Committee did such and such. We don't like that. We're going to change it. What they get is what they get, but they've got a assemble everything and do essentially what the budget committee does. And so they'll do that next week. Then everything will go to the House Rules Committee. That's the next step before there's a final vote on the House floor. This is where things get really tricky because, typically on all big bills like this in the House Rules Committee, this is where they'll do what's called a manager's amendment. And this is where they can tweak some things from one of those committees, one of the 13 committees. So they can say, oh, well, there's some language here we've got to deal with. And so they'll clean it up and that type of thing. That becomes the final bill that goes before the floor. Okay. So that's the process. So it could potentially get to the House Rules Committee conceivably within the next 2-3 weeks. But quite honestly, that's where things maybe fall apart because it's unclear whether the speaker would have the votes to proceed successfully on the budget reconciliation bill. We'll come back to that in a moment, but let's also talk about some other deadlines while we're talking about it. There's that September 27th, 28th deadline that the speaker kind of has out there where she had promised a lot of the House moderate Democrats to take a vote on the Senate passed bipartisan infrastructure bill. She says that she wants that passed out of the House by October the 1st, but she doesn't really have to do that. She can actually delay it through a procedural vote. She may do that really to appease her progressive House Democrats to the angst of those moderates. Because if you recall, the last time we were together, there's a real fight right now between the progressive House Democrats, the moderate House Democrats, as to which one comes first. Do they take up the budget reconciliation first? That's what the progressive side of the House Democrats wants. Or do they take up what the moderates want first, which is the infrastructure bill? So there's a lot of horse trading involved in that. But what also complicates things is no matter what is in the House version, can it pass 50 votes in the Senate?
It almost seems like from the external perspective, I guess, that I'm kind of hearing that maybe that gap's getting a little bit further apart. I guess, would you agree with that? And how do they go about traversing this, I guess, given some of this gap, if you want to call it, in between?
Right. There are several fault lines. Let's talk about those and then talk about how maybe the speaker, how the Senate Majority Leader sutures up those openings because they're certainly there. You've also got this whole deadline, of course, with the fiscal year 2022 spending. So that's September the 30th, but it impacts it. Continuing resolution debate and how they deal with the debt ceiling impacts how things transpire with the budget reconciliation matter. So there's some fault lines there. On the Senate side, of course, again, if we go back to budget reconciliation, you really have three principal pressure points, if you will: office holders, Senate Democrats who are applying tremendous pressure. Those are Senator Manchin, Sinema, and Tester. Senator Manchin and Tester both want all spending to be paid for, at least, offsetted somehow. You probably know this. Most of the listeners probably know this because it's been out there, but Senator Manchin also doesn't want anything above about $1 to $1.5 trillion. Whereas right now on the House side, you're looking at 3.5, potentially even more. Bernie Sanders is saying it's got to be at least 3.5 trillion. At the end of the day, they'll probably get to maybe 2 trillion and cut a deal there. And really, again, the debt ceiling, let's just maybe talk about what I have come up with, maybe about 4 different alternatives of how they solve this, because that's your ultimate question, right?
Yeah.
Number one, the speaker could potentially, once they get the budget reconciliation package done within the House, when it's at Rules Committee, you remember we talked about that in a moment? So they're going to finish up Wednesday. Next week, they go to Budget Committee. Then they would potentially go to Rules Committee. she potentially holds off there until she gets a deal with the Senate. So, in other words, the Senate figures out their path forward to 50. And if that's the case, then I would think that the speaker then would offer a manager's amendment at the Rules Committee and then go forward with the House floor vote because the votes are counted in the Senate. And then, the Senate would take up the bill and move on down the road. So that's route one. Route two, the speaker could hold off on their budget reconciliation package till the Senate gets theirs completely out of the Senate. So there's one way, and then they could take it up. The House votes on budget reconciliation, let's say number 3. Then the Senate votes on that budget reconciliation. Then the House passes the Senate version. Or what possibly could happen is the House pass budget reconciliation. Senate takes that House passed budget reconciliation, and then the Senate Democratic moderates try to make changes to it. Senate passes it, and then the House accepts the changes. In all of those paths, there's a lot of peril in holding everything. I know it's very complicated, but those are really the 3, 4 possible ways to get it done. But at the end of the day, whatever you pass in the House has got to pass the Senate. The Senate's the harder part. And I think that the House will probably accept, I would think, what the Senate passes. And so whatever passes the Senate's got to fall in line with Manchin, Sinema, and Tester. So we kind of figure out what the number is there aggregately. And if you were to ask, okay, well, when do you think this is all going to happen? There's no way this is happening, in my judgment, before late October. It could slip into November. I've always said October. I've been kind of thinking that even since the spring, and probably going to be late October, maybe before Thanksgiving, somewhere in that window.
Maybe I'll ask you a two-parter here. One, maybe we'll go back to 2017 tax reform and the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, and kind of maybe what path was used there. And then, I guess with that in mind, and whichever path we think maybe ends up going, I have to say that the proposal and the what we saw coming introduced, I guess, just yesterday by House Democrats doesn't quite seem to line up with those deal breakers that are being vocalized by those senators. Manchin, I mean, we're clearly larger than that with the pay for the Tester. We're clearly not there either, it would seem. So, it doesn't quite seem to mesh up. Maybe what insight we would have from last go around of tax reform, if you want to call it that, and how do we traverse, these differences when we look like we're not even starting at the same point?
They really are different. I mean, the math's the same. So they both needed, 50, 51 votes in all of these budget reconciliations, but the politics are totally different. And so that's why you really can't compare the two. I'll give you a little bit of inside baseball here. There are several House Democrats, mainly from the Northeast, you've probably been reading about it, that they really want SALT relief. It was not in the current Ways and Means package, but Chairman Neal and others said, hey, we're going to get it for you. Just hang on. Because these members in the House have said, if it's not in there, not only in the House, I mean, there are several senators, Democratic senators. Senator Menendez yesterday even said that if it's not in there, I'm not voting for anything of budget reconciliation. So there is now a discussion of adding a 2-year relief window for SALT and adding it into budget reconciliation. All the progressive Democrats are against that. But if they do that, from what I understand, the number would go up substantially. So then, you run into foul territory, if you will, with Senators Manchin and Tester as to their aggregate number, 1 trillion, 1.5. Maybe they give into that. Maybe not. Maybe they cut from some other areas. So there's a lot of pressure points, but you really can't compare the politics, the content of the politics right now with what they did in 2017. Much like you can't with, when Reagan used this or when President Obama did the ACA package. Same math, different politics.
You kind of mentioned the like the salt cap provision and things that maybe are going to, I don't know if you want to call them negotiating tactics, or they're not in there now, maybe will be. There were also maybe a few items in there that weren't previously discussed, like for example, limiting the section 1202, the qualified small business stock exclusion there for certain taxpayers, where it seemed like maybe they were pulling in a few more things to try to get some the math to work out, I guess, right? And some revenue raisers. Any thoughts or things you're hearing around how some of these provisions might be kind of circling around and getting pulled in?
Specifically related to tax, of course, everything started very broadly when we first started looking at all of this, correct? Back in April, March, when these policies were laid out by the administration and then later by the House and the Senate, which have, very different versions. But there's some things that we have known actually for weeks, sometimes months, of where the votes were, for instance, on certain pieces. Like I'll take, for instance, capital gains. I mean, I was talking with some of our BKD colleagues just last week about that. That's pretty much been well settled now, I think, that the top rate would be 25%. And it's not just a Joe Manchin desire. It's a lot of Democrats on that part. Other ones that we kind of knew that would be there, the top marginal tax rate, 39.6. Grantor trusts, the treatment of grantor trusts. That seemed like that there was quite a bit of votes there for that, 218, 50, that type of thing. What was, maybe a little bit on the surprise, carried interest, because that one, even though it seemed like it was very popular within the Democratic caucus, they are changing things, but they were talking about a total elimination of carried interest. They finally settle on, taxpayer compliance, $80 billion for tax enforcement for high income individuals and things like that. So we knew that was coming. They just really hadn't settled on a number. Not that these are the final numbers, but what the progressive Democrats in the House and Senate really wanted in terms of tax legislation, they did not get. They wanted to really address, in their view, inequities in the system. They certainly did not get that. They didn't get it because there weren't the votes there. Again, this is all about how many votes you can get, and there weren't votes there.
A lot of it sounds like the speaker is going to kind of be in the driver's seat here coming up, and the success of the bill going forward. Any thoughts on that, and maybe what direction she might choose, or kind of what maybe even she's doing now to, in anticipation of that, I guess we'll say?
Well, she's got to principally take care of her two sides of the Democratic conference, and that are the moderates on one hand and the progressives on the other. And they're at odds. But she's also has to look more like a chess game in terms of what would pass the Senate. Because even if she can say, okay, I finally have got my guys and gals ready to go, moderates and progressives, well, if it won't fly in the Senate, it's just not going to happen. So at the end of the day, I do know that there's a lot of shuttle diplomacy taking place between those chambers within the Democratic Party structure to work all that through. And incidentally, the Senate's having to do all of their tough work. They're having to see what passes the Senate Parliamentarian's office and that type of thing, which they've been diligently doing for weeks. But at the end of the day, I think the speaker really can't sign off on a final vote until she knows what passes the Senate. That's even if she moves forward. Again, even if she moves forward with budget reconciliation in the House, it may come back to the House with changes from the Senate. which I suspect if if that happens, they'll vote for it, no matter what the changes are. It's either that or you don't get it.
Right,
And,
right.
they're gonna do it because they've been working so hard on this now. They're gonna do another budget reconciliation next year. We've talked about that, probably in first quarter or second quarter of 2022. And that may be the last one that they do.
Using budget reconciliation round this round too, I know part of like, tying in that debt ceiling, there's been conversations around, well, on the Republican side saying, well, you're going to need to use budget reconciliation to do this. How does that, I guess, enter into this chess game that the speaker is going to be playing here, and how that might impact, I guess, the use of budget reconciliation? And I mean, it's obviously currently not in there, right?
Yeah, so here's some of the permutations as I see it. Democrats wanna, in a perfect world, they would like to include debt ceiling into the continuing resolution. So the continuing resolution, remember, is all about next year's government spending money, fiscal year 2022 spending money. That's all gonna be tied up into a continuing resolution. That's the one that I said they just kinda punt the ball and figure it all out in early December. Okay. So in a perfect world, they want to tie debt ceiling to the CR, the continuing resolution. The problem is they won't get 60 votes in the Senate for it because you have to pass it with 60 votes, 218 in the House, 60 in the Senate. They're not going to get 60 votes because not one Republican, I bet, is going to vote for that. Leader McConnell on the Senate side has made that very clear. So that's probably not going to happen. A marriage between debt ceiling and the CR. I just don't see that. So it could be that the House attaches debt ceiling to continuing resolution, goes to the Senate, doesn't have votes, it gets shut down. So that's number one. Number two, the House just does their own continuing resolution without attaching debt ceiling. And then the Senate passes the continuing resolution. But then the House has to do a standalone debt ceiling bill. Pretty tough. Up and down 218. Maybe they can get that done. I don't think this next alternative would happen, but it's possible, I guess. And that would be the House and Senate put debt ceiling into the budget reconciliation, not the CR. But, if they do that, it really complicates things. I mean, I think that really makes the math tough. It's pretty much a foregone conclusion with some people around here that the House is going to flip based on kind of the law of averages. The reason I bring this up is that there are a lot of House members that aren't real crazy about voting for debt ceilings, budget reconciliation, a $1 trillion infrastructure bill, and a lot of other pretty tough politics. I'll be nice and say that they're having to withstand going into a midterm election year. Makes things very complicated.
And just seems like almost like the perfect storm of all these things. Like you said, those tectonic plates shifting, and it makes it very challenging. So I'll tell you, Travis, I have a lot of conversations with those that are, they have closely held businesses or business owners, and hearing the question of, they're watching everything going on and watching this complexity, almost feeling overwhelmed. We'll say by how complex this is and how fast moving this is. And the question is what do I do? So, for example, in this case, looking at the proposal on the capital gains rate and trying to figure out what actions they need to take, which is obviously driven a little bit by here. Well, what do we land on? What's the provision end up being? And does it actually make it through? So I guess, what would you say? How would you answer those questions to folks that have this feeling of being lost in it all?
Yeah, well, it's normal. I get it. They're right. But here's what they should do. They need to get right now with all of their kind of kitchen cabinet, if you will, their financial advisor, their CPA, their lawyers, right now to have conversations to get ready to take action once all of this becomes law. It is going to happen. I promise you. They're going to get this budget reconciliation deal done. I mean, there's a lot of people that say, they're not going to do it. I think that they're going to get it done. Maybe I'm wrong, but I think they'll get it done. I think, again, it's going to be late October, sometime in November, but there's things that you can do now Everybody knows what they're contemplating. Ways and Means, today is taking up, a lot of these provisions. It's not going to be too terribly different on the Senate side, but get together right now with your kitchen cabinet, those people who know your business, that know your financial background, and begin to game plan different scenarios. Does not mean that you have to paper up deals right now. You can do that on the backside. What you don't want to do is wait, into December and freak out and say, oh my gosh, we got to do something now. What do we do? And then you make poor decisions. And there are going to be a lot of people that do that. That's just going to happen. But the wise person is going to be pay attention to the broader strokes of what's happening right now, like these things that you're seeing in the House Ways and Means. That all of that's probably going to come about. And get together with people that you trust and begin to game plan now for ways to mitigate and to protect.
That's great advice. And I've been hearing the word flexibility thrown around a lot in the conversations, just to kind of get yourself in the best spot that you can be with where things land here. I guess with that in mind, what haven't we talked about that you think perhaps should be in the conversation, if anything, at this point in time?
I think we've covered it. I mean, I know we went over, pretty quickly these different permutations of how they might get budget reconciliation done, but just uppermost, keep in mind that it's all about the Senate. I mean, certainly that's not to discredit the House. They've got very tough math problems over there. They've got different viewpoints within the Democratic caucus over there, but the Senate is really where the fight lays. And so once the Senate figures out what they've got the votes for, that's going to be the bill. I mean, I just can't imagine that the House Democrats say, well, I didn't get everything I wanted. Forget it. They're not going to do that. Really, you just keep that uppermost in mind. And then know the timing. The timing, again, I think this is going to be a late October production, maybe into November. Those are the things to ponder.
One last question on that timing element, because I know obviously we talked about this September 27 for the bipartisan infrastructure deal that the House hasn't taken up yet. And that was sort of what foot's going first here in this process, in this kind of 2-track process. So if kind of what we're saying here is, it pushes out, what happens then with that and the bipartisan infrastructure piece?
The speaker has promised the moderates in her party on the House side to take that up by the 27th, which is a Monday. They're not going to actually be here on the 27th. They would have to take it up later that week. But if she does that, she's got this threat from the progressive side that they don't want that. They said, look, if you do that, deals off. We want the budget reconciliation done first before you do the infrastructure bill. A lot of that's just gamemanship. I think that they're going to figure out a way to get it all done, right? She's really smart and she's very talented. And she's got a really good whip team. She knows how to count votes. She's been doing it for a long, long time, and you can't count her out. It's hard to tell if they can get the bipartisan infrastructure bill done, but I suspect that they will.
The train's left the station and it's en route to the destination, but it may take a little longer to get there.
Right.
It may see a few permutations and haven't quite figured out what track it's going to take to get there. Maybe, that late October, early November timeframe. Does that sound fair?
That's right. You've got it.
Okay. Well, hey, this is it's always insightful talking to you, Travis. I always feel like I walk away with a little more clarity on what's going to happen here, but certainly look forward to keeping that conversation going, because there's going to be no shortage of things to talk about, I'm sure.
We'll be talking soon. Thanks, Damien.
We'll leave it there for today and check back with Travis as the Build Back Better train keeps on down the tracks. In the meantime, be sure to check out the show notes of this episode for links to articles and other episodes of the podcast to learn more about the items we discussed today. And of course, to find out how you can contact Travis and learn more about him. If you haven't already, connect with me on social media. You can find me out on LinkedIn and out on Twitter at Damien Martin CPA. You'll also find me on Instagram at TaxDad and on YouTube by subscribing to our Simply Tax YouTube channel. I'm Damien Martin, and thank you for listening.
The information contained in this episode of Simply Tax is based on data available as of the date of its release. BKD is under no obligation to update this information if changes occur. Applying this information to your specific situation requires careful consideration of all facts and circumstances. Any information provided is not to be considered as tax, legal, or financial advice. Please consult your tax advisor before acting on any matters covered.